Usually when we think about a manual for living a good life, we sort of expect it to be a bit like assembling a piece of flat pack furniture.
Oh, absolutely, like an instruction booklet.
Yeah, exactly. Like it's supposed to be highly logical. Step 1, do this. Step 2, insert peg A into slot B. And, if you follow the objective rules, you get the functional bookshelf.
Right, it's visible.
It's external, right. And frankly, it's comforting because the instructions are just right there in front of you.
Well, we do tend to default to those external checklists. I mean, especially today. There is a deep psychological comfort in being able to see our progress categorized neatly in the physical world.
Right, where success is measurable by what we build or, accumulate.
Exactly. But then you encounter these ancient, deeply philosophical texts, and suddenly that whole instruction manual gets thrown entirely out the window.
Yeah, we are no longer building a bookshelf. We are entirely deconstructing the person trying to build it.
That is a great way to put it.
So, welcome to today's deep dive. Today, we are unpacking a brief but incredibly dense source text about human existence, society, and a behavioral landscape that is profoundly internal.
And it requires a complete paradigm shift from the absolute moment you open it. I mean, the metrics for success here are no longer external achievements, but rather this really intense, microscopic level of internal regulation.
Right. And right at the top of the source material, the text introduces this foundational concept called ububiyya. Now, that translates to slavery or servitude, which, let's be honest, that is a jarring word for modern English speakers.
It is. It carries a lot of heavy baggage.
Yeah, so to be clear, right out the gate for you listening, this framework is not talking about horrific human-to-human subjugation. It is strictly defining a state of absolute servitude to the divine, to Allah.
And that distinction, that is the engine for the entire philosophy we're looking at today.
Yeah.
The text operates on the premise that recognizing one's absolute servitude to the divine, it inherently frees a person from being enslaved to anything else.
Like their own ego, right? Or societal expectations.
Exactly. Or the pursuit of wealth.
Yeah.
If you are entirely subjugated to the divine, you physically cannot be enslaved by the world.
Which sets up the core conflict of the text. It makes this incredibly bold claim right at the start. It says, we live in society, we are social beings, we have to treat everyone differently.
Yes. That adaptability is key.
Right. And to achieve that ability to adapt to everyone uniquely, it breaks human behavior down into this 4-part core. It says we have behavior with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, behavior with oneself, behavior with creation, meaning other people, and finally, behavior with the world.
The architecture here is just massive because the text explicitly states that each of these 4 parts is based on 7 distinct principles.
So that is 28 principles governing literally every conceivable interaction.
28, yes.
And look, we aren't going to try and conquer all 28 today. We are putting a magnifying glass exclusively on part 2, which is behavior with oneself.
Which is probably the hardest one.
Oh, absolutely. Because if you just glance at the 7 principles dedicated solely to how we treat our own internal reality, they demand a level of rigor that is completely at odds with how society operates today.
They really do. And if we look at this calmly and analytically, without immediately rejecting what feels uncomfortable, we can start to uncover the underlying mechanics of this spiritual framework.
Right.
It forces us to ask what genuine self-management actually looks like when you completely remove the ego.
Okay, so let's unpack this. Before we even get to those 7 internal principles, we have to look at the overarching framework.
Right, the macro level.
Yeah. The text opens with this demand that because we are social beings, we have to treat everyone differently. Then it gives us the 4 behavioral cores. And I look at this like a complex operational manual, but my immediate thought is about the categorization. Well, I would assume the self is just a subset of creation or the world, right? But the text categorizes oneself entirely separately. It seems like it's saying the self is this inherently volatile variable that has to be like quarantined before you can interact with anything else.
What's fascinating here is the deliberate isolation of the self from the external environment. You're hitting on the core logic there.
The quarantine idea.
Exactly. The text demands severe compartmentalization. I mean, think about what happens if you treat everyone in society exactly the same.
Oh, it's a disaster.
Right. If a manager uses the exact same communication style with every single employee, or a parent uses the exact same disciplinary approach with very different children, it falls apart.
Because you aren't actually responding to them. You're just projecting your one rigid baseline onto everyone else.
Precisely. Which is exactly why the self must be mastered in isolation first. You literally cannot successfully navigate the macro, other people, or the world without first regulating the micro.
So if your internal behavior is chaotic, your behavior with others is going to be a mess.
It will inevitably be reactive. Yeah. The separation suggests the self is an entity that requires its own distinct set of governing laws.
Okay, so it's almost like a laboratory environment. You have to stabilize the volatile chemical in a controlled vacuum before you introduce it to other elements in the world.
That captures the necessity of the quarantine perfectly. The text treats the unrefined self not as something to be trusted blindly, but as raw material.
Wow. Raw material.
Yeah, raw material that must be heavily processed before it can safely interact with the other territories, of a law, creation, and the world.
Which brings us right into that processing phase. Moving from the macro framework of society directly into the micro internal reality of part 2, the text, it really does not ease you in.
Not at all.
No, it drops the first 3 of the 7 principles of behavior with oneself right on your head: fear, struggle, and tolerating loss.
Uncompromising terms, to say the least.
Seriously. Now, listeners familiar with spiritual or ascetic texts probably know about the concept of self-denial, but I still have to push back on the framing here.
Okay, go ahead.
We live in a world where internal behavior is almost exclusively framed as self-care. Self-compassion, protecting your peace.
Right, the modern wellness movement.
Exactly. So fear, struggle, and tolerating loss. That sounds like a recipe for chronic anxiety. Why start the behavioral manual with what sounds like psychological warfare?
Well, if we connect this to the bigger picture, we have to return to that opening premise of ububia, or servitude. In this specific philosophical context, these principles aren't about self-punishment.
Okay.
They are about situating oneself accurately in the hierarchy of existence.
So I assume fear here doesn't mean like hiding under the bed. It reads more like operational vigilance.
Yes, exactly.
Like a surgeon about to perform a complex operation. They have a healthy fear of making a mistake, but that doesn't paralyze them. It makes them hyper-focused and precise.
I'd actually take that a step further. The word often translated as fear in these traditions is more akin to profound awe and accountability.
Okay, that shifts the tone.
Right. It's the acute awareness of the magnitude of the divine and the fear of failing to fulfill your ultimate purpose as a servant. I mean, if your baseline behavior starts with that level of reverence, arrogance becomes logically impossible.
Because you're too busy being in awe.
Exactly.
Yeah.
You are instantly stripped of the delusion that you are the center of the universe.
Oh, wow. Okay. That makes the second principle, struggle, make a lot more sense. If you aren't the center of the universe, your baseline biological or ego-driven defaults aren't the priority anymore.
Right. They can't be.
So the struggle is just the daily friction of overriding those defaults.
It is the active resistance against spiritual inertia. In a framework based on servitude, the self cannot be treated as a master whose every whim must be satisfied.
Because you already have a master.
Precisely. If you want to sleep, but your spiritual obligation requires you to wake up, the struggle is the mechanism of asserting that the divine command supersedes the body's comfort.
Okay, and then we get to the third principle in this opening trio, tolerating loss. Let's ground this for a second. Imagine you lose your job, or you lose a massive amount of social status. The immediate, unrefined human reaction is total panic.
Absolute panic.
It's almost like an ego death because we attach our literal identity to those external things. How does this framework change that mechanism?
By severing the link between external circumstances and internal worth. If you have genuinely internalized ububia, you recognize that you never truly owned that job or that money or that status in the first place.
They were just on loan.
Exactly. They were always temporary provisions from the divine.
So if you never owned it, losing it is just a logistical shift. It's not an existential crisis.
That is the exact mechanism.
Yeah.
Tolerating loss builds an unshakable internal shock absorber.
I love that phrase, internal shock absorber.
Because if you cannot tolerate loss, you remain endlessly reactive. You become a hostage to your possessions and your reputation.
Yeah, you're constantly guarding the hoard.
Right. And if we tie this back to the opening mandate, treating everyone in society differently, you can't possibly fulfill that if you are in a constant state of panic over your own deficits.
Because if I am terrified of losing my status, every interaction I have with you is going to be fundamentally manipulative.
Yes.
I'm going to be using you to prop myself up rather than giving you what you uniquely need.
You're simply too consumed by the preservation of the self to be of any genuine use to creation.
Wow. Okay, so we've established this tough baseline. The practitioner has cultivated awe, they lean into the friction of struggle, and they've decoupled their worth from external gains by tolerating loss.
The shock absorbers are installed.
The shock absorbers are fully installed. From here, the text shifts from endurance to active refinement with the next two principles: spiritual discipline and seeking truthfulness and sincerity.
Right. This is the transition from preparing the ground to actually planting the seeds.
And here's where it gets really interesting to me, because the sequence matters. It puts discipline before sincerity.
Which is very deliberate.
Right. The best way I can make sense of this is to think of a musician tuning a violin before a concert. You don't just walk on stage, feel a burst of authentic emotion, and hope the instrument sounds good.
No, it sounds terrible.
Right. You systematically tighten the pegs, the discipline beforehand. The sincerity of the music during the performance is entirely reliant on the mechanical discipline that happened in the green room.
That analogy hits the nail on the head regarding the mechanism of action here. And notice how radically different that is from our modern cultural narrative.
Oh, it's night and day.
Today, we equate sincerity with raw, unfiltered impulse. Going with your gut or speaking your truth.
Yeah, the idea is that if I feel it right now, it must be my authentic self.
But this text argues that your unrefined gut is exactly what you're trying to overcome. Your raw impulse is likely just your ego protecting itself.
Oh, man, that's a hard pill to swallow.
It really is. I'd actually challenge you, listening to this right now, how often do you separate the idea of discipline from the idea of sincerity in your own life?
It's a completely foreign concept for most of us. We think of discipline as rigid and robotic, and sincerity as natural and fluid, but this is saying true sincerity is a highly engineered state.
Yes.
So what does that spiritual discipline actually look like in practice?
Well, it looks like a methodical auditing of your own intentions. It is the practice of creating an intentional pause between a stimulus and your response.
Okay.
So before you speak, the discipline is interrogating why you are speaking. Are you trying to help, or are you trying to sound smart?
And if it's the latter?
If you catch the ego trying to sound smart, the discipline is choosing silence.
Which builds the capacity for the fifth principle, truthfulness.
Exactly.
Because if you tighten those strings every single day through discipline, you eventually organize your internal world so that you are fundamentally incapable of being false with yourself.
The discipline makes self-deception impossible. And once you have removed self-deception, the sincerity that emerges isn't just some fleeting mood. It is an immovable state of being.
That is a staggering bar to reach. I mean, you are completely auditing your intentions and severing the ego's ability to lie to itself.
It's a lifetime of work.
But it makes sense why this is placed here in the sequence, because if you actually achieve that level of unshakable internal sincerity, you are ready for the ultimate test.
The final two principles.
Right. The text brings us to the culmination of behavior with oneself, introducing these final two concepts: keeping oneself away from what the self loves and tying the self to poverty or far.
The absolute final frontier of internal regulation.
So what does this all mean? I have to elevate the pushback here because listeners familiar with ascetic traditions know that denying the self is a common theme.
Sure.
But tying the self to literal far poverty while trying to hold down a 9-to-5 job, raise a family, and function in a modern capitalist society,
Right.
it feels wildly contradictory.
It seems impossible at first glance.
Yeah. Is this text demanding that to be a good social being, you have to sell all your possessions and go walk into the woods?
This raises an important question about the difference between physical reality and internal attachment.
Okay, clarify that.
While historically some practitioners did embrace material destitution, in the context of this specific behavioral mastery, FAR is primarily an internal technology.
An internal technology. Walk me through the mechanics of that. How does one practice keeping away from what they love and tying themselves to poverty if they have, a mortgage and a 401k?
Well, it comes back to the concept of the quarantine we discussed earlier. The practice of keeping oneself away from what the self loves is a mechanism for emotional decoupling.
Give me an example.
Let's say the self loves praise.
Right.
It genuinely enjoys being validated at work. The practice isn't to necessarily quit the job, but to actively fast from seeking the dopamine hit of that praise.
Oh, I see. So if you do a great job on a project, the discipline is intentionally not bragging about it, even when you really, really want to. You deny the ego its favorite meal.
Exactly. You systematically starve the attachments. Because when the unrefined self loves something, whether it's validation, comfort, or money, it becomes enslaved to it.
Right. The fear of losing it takes over.
Yes. The fear of losing that thing begins to dictate your behavior.
Yeah.
So by intentionally denying the self what it craves, you prove to your own nervous system that those desires do not govern you.
Which leads directly to fa. Because if keeping away from what you love breaks the chains, tying the self to poverty must be the realization that there are no chains left to break.
Yes.
I assume this means a poverty of the ego.
A profound, deliberate emptying of the cup. Tying the self to poverty is the deep, active realization of one's absolute neediness before the divine and the total rejection of self-sufficiency.
Okay.
You can be a millionaire, but if you have achieved true far, that money is in your hand, not in your heart.
Because if it vanishes tomorrow, your internal state remains completely unchanged.
Precisely.
You already view yourself as owning nothing. You have already accepted that even your next breath is an unearned gift.
And consider how that transforms your interaction with the world. If you view your ego as having no inherent wealth, power, or entitlement, you become entirely unbribable.
Wow. Unbribable.
The world cannot tempt you because you have already tied your identity to having nothing but your servitude.
It's the ultimate hack. The world can't threaten someone who has already willingly surrendered everything internally. And wait, this suddenly closes the loop on the very first premise of the text.
How so? Connect the dots.
The opening mandate was, we live in society, we have to treat everyone differently.
Right.
Right. Well, if I am full of my own desires, chasing validation, guarding my wealth, worrying about my status, I have absolutely no bandwidth to see you clearly.
No, you don't.
I will treat you based entirely on what you can do for me or how you threaten my attachments.
You view society through the distorted, selfish lens of your own ego.
But if I have achieved fakkur, if I have systematically starved my ego of what it loves and emptied my internal cup entirely, I become a perfectly clear lens.
Yep.
I can look at creation, look at society, and finally give people exactly what they uniquely need because I need absolutely nothing from them in return.
It is a radical paradigm of selflessness, achieved not through passive empathy, but through incredibly intense, almost aggressive self-regulation.
Yeah.
You become a perfect conduit for society only by mastering the quarantine of the self.
Man, let's take a moment to recap this journey because we have covered some profound philosophical ground today.
It is a lot to process.
It really is. We started with the broad requirement that because we are social beings, society demands we treat everyone uniquely. This requires mastering a 4-part behavioral core.
And we focused exclusively on the prerequisite for all of it, mastering behavior with oneself.
Right. We saw that this isn't about gentle affirmations. It is a rigorous operation. It starts with the heavy lifting of cultivating awe and fear, leaning into the friction of struggle, and tolerating loss to decouple our worth from external events.
Setting the foundation.
Exactly. And from there, we move to the active tuning of our internal instrument, using spiritual discipline to forge an unshakable engineered truthfulness and sincerity.
Ultimately culminating in the total liberation of the self. Deliberately keeping away from the ego's cravings and tying our internal identity to far, an absolute poverty of self-entitlement.
This framework sounds ancient, but for you listening today, it provides a fascinating counter-narrative to modern life.
It definitely does.
I mean, we live in a consumer culture that constantly insists the path to happiness is feeding the self, right? Indulging your desires, acquiring more wealth, more peace, more status.
Fill the cup as much as you can.
Exactly. But this text argues the exact opposite. It suggests that true freedom isn't getting everything you want. It is systematically dismantling the infrastructure of wanting in the first place.
It holds up a very challenging mirror to our modern habits. It asks us to view internal discipline not as a restriction of our freedom, but as the only viable mechanism for achieving it.
I want to leave you with a final thought to mull over as you go about your day. We started by comparing manuals for living to building flat pack furniture.
Right, the bookshelf.
Yeah. But what we've unpacked today isn't a manual for building anything. It is a blueprint for profound internal demolition. The text insists that treating everyone uniquely is the core rule of existing in society.
Yes.
Could it be that mastering this incredibly harsh discipline of the self intentionally denying what the ego loves and tying your identity to total internal poverty is actually the only way to become truly empty and selfless enough to give everyone else exactly what they need?
That is the ultimate question.
Think about what your interactions would look like tomorrow if you stopped trying to build a bookshelf to hold all your desires and instead focused on emptying the room completely to make space for the world.
A challenging and vital question to carry forward.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.